if you're here at this year's KubeCon, come and see the booth. Either come and see the Keysight booth or
the Akamas.
Akamas.
That's where I'm hanging out with my friends there, and I'm going to be wandering around these hallowed halls for a little while too. And if you are at KubeCon, come see me. Maybe you'll be on a future episode of one of my shows.
So yes, so Scott is here. He's recording the performance tour. So for those who don't know about Scott's a legend in the performance landscape. And yesterday he was talking about, well, what does that really mean in this kind of new containerized landscape, right? What kind of principles do we do? What kind of steps do we do? What does observability really mean? What does, how do we understand non-functional requirements and defining what, we should be expecting those environments to perform, chaos engineering. And, I think that kind of starts us off on this kind of journey that, what have you seen while you've been at KubeCon? What's kind of, to you, the highlight so far?
What I try to do when I walk around and look at the various companies that are represented here and the activities, the talks that are going on, they're sort of like I'm three personas in one. Because I try to put myself in different shoes. There's the practitioner, the people who would actually do the work. And so they're looking at things from one way. How does this help me solve this problem that I have? Then there's like an executive or a manager or check writer that would be the person that says, I have people who do the practitioner work, but I would need to find out about this. I need to educate this. Is this something that we can use to transform what we're doing already? And then there's that third person, which is sort of the analyst, right? So you've got your Gartners and Forresters who are looking to see what's new, what feature are they announcing here at this conference, and what's going on with, so that they can kind of help rate them for the leaderboard. So I try to put myself in the shoes of each one to see how do they view that, right? And so depending on where I'm at the time is sort of how I'm thinking.
And I think you just highlighted something which I'd not observed at all, right? So we had a couple of analysts over. There was one of the co-founder, one of the ITKO guys, which, we can get onto service virtualization in a second. He's now an analyst, and, we've got a call today with a session with an SD Times. And, I guess when you're looking at trends, this is the place to be, right?
That's right.
You can walk from every single location and actually learn something new, get some insight about, how things are changing, how the tech's evolving, the new challenges that their customers are finding, and kind of be able to put some really interesting, points out. I'm literally looking at the Cisco booth, and it's like service mesh, policy as code, Cube clarity, app security, functional clarity, Cube flow, media streaming mesh. I don't even know what a media streaming mesh is.
And there's new buzzwords every day.
Exactly. And in a way, they're actually creating those buzzwords as well. And that's what I like about this, is that you are feeling like it's the birth of the next big thing, right?
I think
and
so.
that must be so hard as an analyst to understand, well, what's noise? What is going to be here in 3 to 4 years? And how do we get people to adopt it? And then you've got those execs, you've got the CIOs. How are they going to understand, well, what does this mean? How does that mean, make a difference with, we were talking about it this morning, culture and people, process, technology? How does that affect everything?
Right.
What's your viewpoint? If you're a CIO and, your guys are just spinning K8 up and, trying to do all this really cool next gen stuff, how do you even explain the value of that?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and it goes even beyond that. I mean, we have been talking, and everybody else has been talking about moving from these monoliths to microservices, componentizing everything, and going to containerized applications, which increases complexity. Even if all you're doing is shifting everything to a cloud provider, that's not the end point, right? It gets more complex than that. What's coming next after that? So let me stop there for a second and say what I see here is companies and vendors and solutions, maybe they're even open source solutions that are trying to solve the complexity issues you're dealing with now with what I just said. Microservices, moving, digital transformation, all of these things. But now let's say some companies are getting ahead to that. What is that next piece of complexity? Multi-cloud, or what's being now called the super cloud. So
Mega Cloud. I heard about Mega Cloud as well.
Yes.
I don't know if Megatron is part of the Mega Cloud, but Super Nintendo, anything with the word super was important, right?
So super cloud, I've heard it called Meta Cloud, but it's different from just a hybrid cloud solution, which,
Okay.
but if you had that, like you've got a cloud provider, maybe you got some on-prem and you got a combination, you've got your own private cloud. As you start talking about that, the thing that comes up in my mind is, okay, it's even more complex. And what if the cloud providers have to provide a new layer that even supersedes what they've done before? They've taken away the bare metal. They've taken away a lot. That you can go serverless now, right? But what if you need to go serverless across all cloud providers to make sure you're resilient, and that every call that was made, every time you open up a web page, you don't even know which cloud provider you're going to?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that require more monitoring, more complexity? More, it's all there. So, which means these same companies are probably thinking about how they're going to solve that problem too. It's one thing to solve the problem for a single cloud provider and move it to containerized services, but moving everything across 10 cloud providers to make sure it never goes down, because we know AWS would never go down, especially a region or anything, and never take multiple companies. But in the case it does, we have to make it resilient, and that's where we're going next.
So I'm gonna, I was talking to the analyst yesterday, and I love the family of ITKO, right? And they created a product called Lisa. Mm-hmm. You'll be familiar with Lisa, right?
Yep.
And I remember going to, I want to say, what's the, I was a place it was in, I think it was Texas, or it might have been Austin, and we were like, I went to see a customer, and it was a large mobile telco company, right? And they were like, we're using service virtualization. And it was like, oh, this is really cool, really great technology. And they said, but we've also got this use case, which is sometimes we get traffic coming in, which is hitting us quite hard. And so we actually use it as a honey trap, right? We use it. So people are still getting those 200 acknowledgements or whatever it is that they need, but they're able to actually, move the rest of the traffic, or move the DNS or Cloudflare, reconfigure Cloudflare or F5 or whatever it is, to allow them to shift away from that kind of, intrusion, right?
Right.
And I think, part of it is security, another layer on top of that. You've got site reliability engineering and resilience and chaos engineering, another layer on that. There's all sorts of disciplines in that landscape. And, I'm a bit naive, but, my understanding when we talk about Megatron Cloud was the idea as a transformer was you're able to go, if I'm getting hit over here, quite hard, maybe I'm getting a massive denial of service attack. People are firing their IoT endpoints of their home systems, right, at my endpoint. So I want to then be able to kind of come down from this system, maybe morph onto even 10, right, or morph out to another cloud vendor, or put my services across a number of different vendors that aren't in this kind of situation. And I should be able to morph between those seamlessly without any end user experiencing any kind of problems, right? Whether it be OAuth or some kind of two-factor authentication, or some kind of platform that's dependent on Salesforce, SAP, Oracle, whatever it is. And my viewpoint is, maybe I'm wrong, it's like sometimes people build cloud-first platforms. Like we're guilty sometimes of doing this for things like knowledge graphs, and they use AWS native services that can't easily be decoupled and moved to Neo4j or some other kind of language. So, I love this idea of agnostic, and this ability to do Megatron Cloud, but I don't know if we all have our favorites, like we always do, have a favorite that we end up building in there with not that view that maybe it's the best enterprise solution, and also the ability to deal with security challenges as well as scale. And because we really like this, we love, Datadog, or we love SourceGraph, or we love, Aqua. I love Aqua. Usually when it's got beer as added to it as well. But,
right.
So do you think this is a change we're seeing, is that it's got to be this kind of open cloud, really that ability to, that easy, that says I can move to anything, from anything, for any one of your services, service mesh, or, media streaming mesh, is that kind
insert variable here.
Insert variable here. Is that where we're going? Because I don't know if I've heard the word open test until you just invented it. Open cloud.
Open cloud. Well, super cloud, open cloud, whatever.
Yeah.
There's a few people talking about it right now. VMware is one of the companies that was in the forefront of doing this and kind of moving to that service. But for every person who says this is my favorite cloud provider, there's another client on that cloud provider who thinks they're being locked into that vendor, and there's a fear of that, right? So I think that's the balance. There is, we've had this vendor lock-in situation, and then of course they control the pricing of that, and you really don't have a big say in that. You can figure out ways to reduce that bill, make it more efficient, make less calls, do whatever. But I think the time will come when, and I think it's now, where even Amazon or Microsoft has sat back and said, look, if we got all the business for everybody in the world, we can't hire enough people to service that. They've kind of realized that now. So it's okay. There's enough business for everybody. Let's share, at least to the point where we should, and at least work together to make these applications completely resilient. Because nobody now that I know of, because of the outages over the last couple of years, is going to rely on a single region in a cloud provider, and even multi-regions aren't getting it now. So that's what I think you're looking at, is another layer that kind of takes that burden away of knowing, hey, we've got to write this code for Azure, we got to write this code for Google, we got to write this code for AWS. Let's just write the code and put it into something. I don't know what that's called right now, but then we don't have to care. But when we get the bill, we know where it went, and then we control that. So there's probably some new routing schemes for that. And I'm not trying to talk too intelligent to it, because I'm just researching it myself now. But then think about, how is that going to be tested when you don't know where the call is actually going, and it may go through a totally different type of system on the back end that you may not even be aware of? How do you test for the weakest link?
And so this brings me to something which I was speaking to Andreas about at Dynatrace, literally at the Star West event, right? So I was kind of talking to him about open testing, open test data, and open telemetry, right? And part of that open testing was this kind of question of, like, I'm just going to pick on somebody who's there, Cisco, right? If Cisco are developing a new product, they're going to test it, right? They're going to have a whole stack of test scripts. If I integrate with Cisco for some of their technology, they should be able to provide me those tests, those results to those tests, and allow me to kind of be able to run them, to build confidence around how I've implemented Cisco in my organization, right?
At least for the vanilla.
For the vanilla version, right? And then, as a separate thing, from an open telemetry perspective, is if I'm reliant on Cisco's endpoints, I should have visibility or observability into their telemetry information. So you're seeing, if you remember the old days of Salesforce, you'd say to them, what's going on? And they go, we can't tell you, because we're not, they don't want to say, look under the hub and say, oh, your baby's ugly. They kind of want to keep a thing and say, everything's looking fine from our side. I think now observability goes beyond what you implement for your own internal systems, but to your actual customers should have access to your observability in the same way that you should. If you rely on a third-party system, any of these companies here, they give you open testing, they give you the access to the tests and the execution and all that information, but also the trace all the way through from an observability and open tracing, open telemetry landscape into their system. So you bring it into Datadog and you kind of say, actually, we're seeing that there's a huge amount of traffic on your authentication servers. You're spinning more up, but actually you're maxed out at the moment. Maybe we move away from that temporarily, just so that we know that we're not going to have any outages, right? And I think that's the missing piece. If you think of the old days in performance, the first thing you do is look at all the CDN calls and all the dependencies on a web page, and you kind of go, and this is the whole cross-site serving kind of services kind of problem, right? Was that you're reliant so much on third parties, but you don't have no visibility into how they deploy, develop, and test.
That was the big problem, is especially for a SaaS app, what can you see other than the end user timings and as far as you can go? Because they're not going to tell you, okay, let's put a monitor on this server that's sitting back here. They're not going to do that. And they're not going to tell you what their secret sauce is as to make it. But to get this kind of observability information that's being available to you now, that's actually a really welcome and refreshing change. But it's absolutely needed. This month, October, the middle of October, we released this October version of the Performance Tour, and I interviewed a person named Jeremy Profit, works for Ally. Completely serverless environment. I was surprised to find out that his biggest concern is not him, everybody else that he's relying on. Because there's so much reliance on third parties, he has to observe the stuff that they create, their Lambda functions, their whatever they do. But he doesn't trust anybody else. He can't. I mean, it's, yes, he trusts them, but it's trust and also verify. So that's the biggest thing. So he has to have observability to be able to prove he's not the problem, but also all the people he's got dependencies for, that they're not the problem either. And he has to notify them when they're having a problem, but they also have to notify. So there's when you go serverless like that, you have to rely on this information and notify each other.
I love it. You know, I don't think I've ever heard the word trust with the word, verify. It's like the two separate things, right? Trust and test, the two T's we'll call them from now on,
Right.
is absolutely essential, and it completely makes sense, right? And this is kind of where, yesterday I was talking about, but the wider conversation was around, how do you know the quality of somebody else's product? So if you give me a second, if we're talking about, Cloud Casca or Sourcegraph, right? Let's say these guys, if I looked at them as a kind of, like you get with an energy efficiency thing, right? They're a C+, they've got good processors, they've got high availability, they're very secure, they've been audited, all this kind of stuff. They've got this ranking of C+, right? But I'm a financial services, or I'm a mission critical kind of company. I only do business with people who are B+ or A triple. I know this didn't help the Lehman Brothers, but AAA status products,
Right.
because part of that AAA standard means that they tell us what the stack is, the vulnerabilities. They notify us as soon as there's a vulnerability in their stack and look at Log4j or whatever it is to get quickly resolved. They share the log analytics data. They share the telemetry data. They have transparency. They have ITAR kind of import-export laws in place. They have confidentiality, all the structure that they need to do business with military, healthcare, or whatever. And then, of course, there can be other organizations that are literally there to be in ultra-fast startup mode. What maybe is, each release is changing. It's going from a C down to an F because they've released something that's really quite poor, and it's having a massive cascading effect. We kind of need, as much as it seems to oversimplify it, this kind of energy efficiency status, but we need something that tells us Intel is a AAA company, right?
Right.
And it is. I know if I go to the Hillsborough office, campus in Portland, right? They're all engineers. The 10,000 of them, all engineers, career engineers, building, stuff that's secure, resilient, and stable, right? And if we remember the old days of AMD, Citrix, all the kind of early days where people were starting to compete in this chip manufacturing area, Intel are the one that everyone always associated with quality, right?
Right.
So do you think we need to kind of expose more and allow people to kind of look under the hood and not just say we've got a V12 in there, but we're not going to show it you because we know we've got it?
I'm the biggest advocate of that. I think they need to be sharing that information with us. I don't know that you can get them to do that, but that's something I've been begging for a while. If there is something that is, for example, I care about if something's slow.
Yeah.
If something is slow, when I've had to deal with SaaS vendors, you get that pushback. And I haven't seen anything but pushback. I would like to see more openness. I don't know that we'll get it, but we always push for it.
Yeah.
And that's an inherent problem with moving to completely SaaS.
Yeah.
That you lose that lack of control. So I guess that really goes back to the difference between a service level objective that you're trying to achieve in-house and a service level agreement, which should actually be put into a contract when you're doing this. Now, I have advocated since, I would say, 20 years now. Every client I go to, I always ask the question, when you brought on this vendor that you're working with, maybe it's a customized version of a product, or maybe you just brought down their SaaS app and that's what you're using is SaaS application. Did you negotiate not just uptime, not just we're guaranteed that we're going to be, you can ping us 99% of the time, but did you say this is what our service level agreement, that if you can't meet that, you need to tell us why, and if you can't, we probably don't have to pay, or you give us a discount or whatever. It was never negotiated.
No.
And then if they did, the vendor would say, okay, we'll just go find somebody else as a customer, which is surprising. It depends on who the SaaS vendor is, if they've got a lot of customers, because they're not willing to give that. That's been a problem for a long time. So how many times do you think out of that 20 years I've ever successfully gotten a contract negotiated with performance requirements in it?
I would say probably 3%, you know, that kind of, it's like getting sign-offs for non-functional requirements that are evolving every single day, right?
Well, let's just say if you had one hand and you had all fingers chopped off, you still would be ahead of the number of times I've ever had that done.
But
so I don't expect it.
I think you've raised a really interesting question because, you know, let's, you know, load runner, right? Let's think about, they had SLA violations in there. You used to be able to describe, you know, if this doesn't do it, set off an alarm, set a flag off, right? You know, in its absolute basic form, there's an SLA around performance, right? An SLA around security, an SLA about availability. And, you know, just because you've got all nines, what does that mean if suddenly you go down for the next 4 weeks, right?
The server's responding. The server, when you ping it, says, I exist. I'm not going to give you the web page,
but I'm still all nines.
But we're all here.
But you know, that's the whole thing, is how do you deal with, and it was one of the things that I remember raising a long time ago about systemic failure, right? You know, to me, I know we're talking a little bit about chaos, and I was impressed with the AWS guys because they recently launched a fault injection service, right? And I said, that's brilliant, right? Yeah. You know, I'm hitting Kafka, I've got consumers, you know, I've got to get an API to Kafka at some point in time before it gets on the bus. You know, the producers are on there, and I got consumers reading from the stream. Okay, what happens when I pull break 3 pods down? What happens when, you know, I do this? You know, I need something which is going to do all that fault injection for me, because I don't want to use the word happy payload. I just think it's being used too much. And I like the idea of happy payload. You know, don't send the same payload hand scripted that you know is going to work. Same real user monitoring, right? To me, I love Splunk, AppD, Dynatrace, New Relic. I love their real user monitoring. But in essence, it's happy path, right? Is this API up? Not, you know, the edge case of this user just had, you know, a declined credit card, and now we're having to talk to WorldPay or PayPal or Apple Pay and put this negative response code, because obviously it's live services, and we're kind of just, okay, we just want to make sure, can I see WorldPay? Can I do this? And I think real user monitoring, I know Splunk have just done a whole stack of rendering what real user monitoring looks like, but it kind of feels like we've got some lessons that we could potentially pass on to the APM guys, in the same way that the APM guys have taken data visualization and predictive analytics to a whole new world that we could learn from them. And if DevOps, you know, and there's that harmonization, is that I think we've got a lot to learn from a lot of other discipline areas, and bringing them together is not going to be an easy feat.
It never was. DevOps' goal and heavenly dream was to get those silos broken down so that ops could feed back to dev and QA and testing a more realistic scenario, so it could be more realistic for when it does roll out. They know what to expect. There's less surprises. Yeah. I don't really see it happening a whole lot except by top tier companies. Top performers do, and they get it, and they get a lot of value out of it. The other companies are like, well, we're just doing what we can do. And that kind of brings me to the soapbox that I do want to get on just a little bit.
Hit it.
Because when we talk about DevOps, DevSecOps, and all, what's missing? What's missing in Dev and Ops?
Well, you would say QA or test, right?
That's right. So the biggest assumption that's being made is that QA can be encapsulated into development. And I think that is the most erroneous and almost offensive thing as a person that comes out of QA, and I think yourself too. I don't know if I speak for you, but that's very offensive to me, because the assumption that a developer is a great tester has never, in my experience of 30 years in IT, never been proven to be accurate. They're developers, and testers good testers will have a totally different mindset. And so even performance engineers, they have a different mindset than a functional tester. Security penetration testers, they have a different mindset. And to say that all of that can be encapsulated inside of the almighty developer mind is not a great idea. And I've seen this when we came out with the SDET. Everybody wants to be an SDET, a software development engineering test. That means they have the abilities of a developer, as if that's so technical versus test automation, and they have a heart of a tester. Well, I've never seen that heart come out myself. I'm sure they're out there, and I'm not trying
to... It's a yellow brick road kind of scenario, isn't it?
I'm not trying to put them down, but I'm just saying I've never seen that. So it's like a unicorn. They're there, but they're rare. What's your thoughts about that? I mean, it's missing, right?
It is missing. And we talked a little bit about Spotify yesterday, right? And I think we have this, and I mentioned the whole playlist and, the fact that You know, you've got dev anarchy, you've got this kind of ability where, and we used to have a team which was called Batman, right? And Batman was the person who was pretty much running operations overnight. They were part of the DevOps team, but you know, they were on Monday night for 3 hours. If there's anything wrong with the system, they would sort it out, right? And it was a hero culture of somebody who's awesome, being so incredibly responsible for knowing so much about all of the systems and be able to be, in essence, accountable on this as one person, like Superman, to be able to come in and save the day. And we've said that the whole point is we don't want champions. We don't want to be this reliant on these, you know, these superheroes.
You can't build a company on heroes.
You can't. And I think this is the thing, is we kind of saying to people, like, let's build a squad, let's build a team, and they're going to have infrastructure guys, they're going to have security guys, they're going to have testers, they have developers. And then what we know is, you know, you can't allocate just one developer. You can't just, what happens when that tester's not well or got COVID? Yeah, part of it is, do we need to know all of the skills for every single part? Do I literally need to know quantum computing so I can use your quantum? You know, how can I possibly know all of this stuff?
Right.
And I think maybe that's the weakness, right? Is that we've told people not to specialize. We've told them to be a jack of all trades, master of none, when they are Jedis out there, like yourself, in performance, Jedi. But
I'm still limited in scope.
Exactly.
I may be able to go across the whole life cycle and advise developers. That's one area where we're testing.
Yep.
But that's not where it's limited to. What about when the requirements are being created? You know, they are being created right before you get into it. And testing is done also on the other side when we shift right before. So the big integrated test before it goes to production and even after. So it's not just limited to that one area. That's the biggest problem I see. So, I mean, I don't really think that I'm the one that's going to necessarily solve that problem, because there's smarter people than me that haven't. But I just feel like you said, you just can't know everything. And it seems to be this mentality that there are people that you should just be able to consume and know all this stuff. And suddenly you're just this highly paid SRE, SDET, whatever you want to call the title.
Yep.
And you know that. Well, just tell me how that works in the medical field. Your heart surgeon, is he doing a pedicure on you earlier in the day? Or, you know,
gig economy, he's going to have a few jobs. She.
Yeah, make sure that they do that after the colonoscopy too. So I just don't, there has to be specialization. And a lot of my DevOps SRE friends they don't like that. They argue with me about that. They debate that. But especially performance, and security, I would argue that it's a specialty skill set if you want to go deep and you want to be really good at it. But so there are some companies who maybe performance isn't the biggest deal to them. You know, maybe they're just announcing birthday websites or something and they don't make a lot of revenue from that. That's fine. But when we're talking about regulatory stuff, we're talking about financial institutions, you know, those type of things that are critical services. Yeah, I think it's important, and you got to have specialization.
I love it, and I think we're gonna finish on that. Is that I don't think there's any reason why not to specialize, right? Build a trade, hand it down from generation to generation. You know, become an engineer, right? Mm-hmm. And you said it yesterday. You know, we need a performance manifesto. Effective performance engineering. We need to bring the engineering back, and you know, we need to bring some of those disciplines back that have been lost, and to protect the next generation of, you know, infrastructure, platform, you know, software, hardware. You know, it's so complex. There's a place for you in that structure. There's a place for you in the future. You know, learn as much as you can, but don't try and learn everything and be a jack of all trades. You know, be passionate about what you want to do.
I've got a great idea. We call the performance manifesto Perfman for the hashtag, and we create the hero again. The Perfman. There you go.
Perfman, as we're going through and flying off into the sunset. So with that said, we created superheroes. So I'm joined by a superhero, and thank you so much for a great session. And you know, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
Thanks for having me.